All right, I believe that's recording now. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to start out and talk a little bit about the brain. If you have a question, you can send it to the chat. I have the chat window open. Or if you want to raise your hand or wave at me, if you catch my eye, I kind of have you all pulled up on my side screen here. So if I'm looking over there, that's when I'm looking at you all. And I'm happy to stop and answer questions, or if something doesn't make sense, I'm happy to sort of back up and go over that again. So feel free to jump in. I want this to be as interactive as a online Zoom course can be. So sort of to start out today, the nervous system, maybe you remember, is broken down into two basic parts. Our central nervous system, which is what we're going to spend most of today talking about with sleep. I'm not really going to get too much into the peripheral body with sleep, although sleep certainly affects things like our cardiovascular system and our immune system. But the central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord, everything that's encased in the skull and the spine, is one part of the nervous system, and it's kind of fundamentally different than the other part, which is our peripheral nervous system. So everything that's outside of the brain and spine, the spinal cord, is the peripheral nervous system, and that involves sort of two major parts. One is called the somatic system, and that's our incoming sensations, so all of our touch sensations in our body, and our outgoing motor sensations, our ability to control our muscles. The other half of the peripheral nervous system is called the autonomic nervous system. And you can think about autonomic as sort of being automatic. And it has two parts that sort of oppose each other. The sympathetic nervous system, which is arousing, and the parasympathetic, which is a calming system. And so if we briefly look at that, this system is designed for gearing up our body in response to a stimulus. And typically this is an external stimulus, although certainly mental stressors can activate the sympathetic nervous system as well. So the sympathetic nervous system, you may have heard it referred to as your fight or flight system. It is what is going to energize your body to respond typically to some external threat or external stimulus. The opposite side is the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is going to bring everything back down to homeostasis, or return to sort of normal, relaxed functioning, not in that aroused state. And you can see in this diagram that both the sympathetic system on the left and the parasympathetic on the right go to all of our major organs in our body. They can activate muscles as well. So they're really, it acts throughout our entire physical system. As I mentioned, they act in opposition to one another. Their behavioral effects oppose one another. So the sympathetic system speeds up the heart. The parasympathetic system slows down the heart. Right? The way that they're able to do this is by having different pathways to these organs, and by using different chemicals, which we're going to talk about, neurotransmitters. So for instance, how does your heart know that the sympathetic system is activating it and it should speed up? Well, it's because the sympathetic system releases a chemical called norepinephrine, and we'll talk a lot about norepinephrine quite a bit when we talk about the sleep systems. Or if the parasympathetic system is activating the heart to slow down, it's going to activate it with a chemical called acetylcholine, ACH. And so the heart can recognize the difference between these two chemical signals and knows how to respond, either speed up or slow down. And that's how we can get these different effects on the targets. And that's an important point to understand, because when we move into the brain and we start talking about the brain, neurotransmitters act in the same way. We use these chemical signals so that we can do different things in the brain. We're also going to use electricity to send signals, but electricity is just an on or off signal. It's very hard to have a target know if the difference between electricity from one area and another area. It's just on or off. But chemicals can do different things. So that's a really important point. The autonomic nervous system is designed to be activated in brief periods in response to physical stimuli. It's usually minutes in length. Unfortunately, though, that arousal, that excitation that comes from that physical stimulus can be transferred, right? So you're driving down the road and someone pulls out in front of you and you have to maneuver to avoid them. And this is going to now generate a sympathetic nervous system response, and you're going to start sweating and your heart rate's going to go up and your stomach's not going to feel great because you're turning it off. And that person speeds away, and the person in the car with you says something about how, comments on your driving, and you yell at them, right? Because this is now transferable. You're not really mad at them, but you're transferring that excitation over to the person in the car. So we see this you probably see this sometimes with things like conduct disorder, where people are excited or upset about one stimulus and it transfers over to someone else in the room. All right, so moving into the central nervous system, the fun stuff. The brain has basically kind of three parts. It has an inner part that we can't really see in these pictures. That's sort of the more primitive area. It's areas that are involved with basic life functions like breathing and heart rate, things like hunger and reproduction and sleep that we'll talk about today is one of those primitive parts. In fact, every single animal sleeps, and we'll talk about how important that is, the fact that it's across all species. And then this outer sort of wrinkled layer of the brain is called the cortex. And this is where most of our complex thought processes are happening. We have this little area here in the back of the brain that's called the cerebellum. That area is involved with functions of learning and memory. It's also involved with coordination, hand-eye motor coordination. And then the rest of the brain is divided into two hemispheres, a left and a right. And this is where, again, most of the cognitive processing takes place. These two hemispheres function as one unit. They're connected to one another. They're connected through a series of wires, essentially, that we're going to call axons. And these bundles of axons share information so that the brain functions as one complete system. There are some rare cases of epilepsy, in which case the only way to treat the epilepsy, this very debilitating epilepsy, is to sever this connection, the corpus callosum, so to actually go in and cut and separate the left and right hemispheres so that when the epileptic seizure starts on one side of the brain, it can't spread to the other side of the brain and fully debilitate the person. And those are some really interesting case studies because these people essentially have two functioning brains that are no longer talking to each other within the head. And probably the most interesting thing about that, and I'm sort of going on a tangent here because it is really interesting. There's several really cool videos on YouTube if you're interested. Is that if you were to meet one of these split brain patients in real life, you would not be able to tell that they had two functioning brains. They are very normal. It's very difficult unless you do some controlled psychological testing to be able to see the differences in the functioning of those two sides. So anyway, if we were to cut the brain right in half, like that green line is, and look at it from the side, this area colored in purple, should actually, if we looked at that, would be white in color, is that corpus callosum. If we were, and so you can see how it connects the left side and the right side. If we were to make another cut, let's say from ear to ear and look straight in the head, the brain would look like this. And again, we can see the left and the right side and how this series of wires is essentially connecting everywhere. Every part of this side of the brain is interconnected to every part of this side of the brain. So it really does function as a single unit in most people. All right. So what's with all this wrinkly structures everywhere? Well, all of these structures have specific names, and we know a lot of their specific functions in the brain, and it's a lot. right? This is looking down on the brain. If we look at a side view, you can again see all these different areas. But what we're going to focus in on is 4 sort of major lobes of the brain and kind of understanding how the brain works in terms of these 4 lobes. And so we're going to start with the back of the brain, which is the occipital lobe. And this is a center for vision processing. As you can imagine, taking light that's coming in from our eyes that is constantly changing and programming that into electrical signals in our retina, in our eye, and then shooting those electrical signals up to our brain, and then trying to reconstruct from a bunch of electrical signals what we're seeing in this rich visual environment is a hugely complicated task. And we can see that by how much of the brain is dedicated to doing this task of vision. It's almost a quarter of your brain is dedicated to reconstructing this rich visual world. And you think about it, it's like if you were on a Zoom call where you didn't have a good connection and the video's kind of lagging, right? Imagine if our vision worked that way. We have to see everything in real time. I mean, the processing power of the brain is really remarkable in terms of that. And we dedicate a lot of computational processing power to doing that task. Just in front and to the top of the occipital lobe, in kind of salmon color there, is further visual processing, sort of more complex visual processing, but also an area for touch. And that's so this dark area here, this one little strip, is all the processing we give for all the touch in our body, from our toes all the way up to our head. And so you can see, again, sort of in comparison, how sort of simple touch is compared to how complex vision is in terms of how much we dedicate to it. And then below the parietal lobe, in that orange colored lobe there, we have a small area dedicated to hearing. Again, that dark orange area, very tiny area, in order to help us detect sounds in the environment compared to touch or vision. And then the rest of the temporal lobe is really involved in memories and in storing memories. So this is kind of like the hard drive of your brain. This is where we're going to encode things and where we're going to go look to retrieve memories, to get memories, to access those memories. And we're going to talk a lot about memory today, because it turns out that helping us form memories and helping us sort of connect those memories to each other is a really, really important process of sleep. And then finally, we have the frontal lobe. And there's a lot going on in the frontal lobe, so it gets its own slide. So in the frontal lobe, we have an area for smell. The dark purple area is motor, right in front of touch. So this is all of our movement systems. And actually, this whole sort of about half of the rest of the frontal lobe is also involved with motor processing and helping us coordinate motor movements, which leaves this very tip, maybe 1/8 of the brain up here, to do all the really complex stuff that we think of the brain doing, like decision making and emotion or personality or evaluating consequences or creativity, right? So it's really kind of remarkable when you look at the brain to think about a huge chunk of the brain is dedicated for sensory and motor perception, over half the brain, right? And those sensory motor functions are organized in the left and right brain to control our left and right side of the body. It's contralateral, it's sort of opposite there. So if you have brain damage on one side of the brain, it's going to have negative effects on the other side of the body. So we have all this area devoted to sensory and motor cortex. We also have 2 big areas on the left side of the brain that are involved with speech and language. Again, probably besides vision, communication learning a language and being able to produce that language and all the things that go along with that is one of the more complex things that our brain does. And it does it at such an automatic level, right? And then we have this huge, eighth of the brain or so for memory. And it really just leaves this little tip part of the brain out here for all that, what we call cognition, all the thinking parts of the brain. All right, we doing good? Okay, are we doing good so far? Haven't lost anyone? Everybody's still awake? That's a good thing, right? Okay, good. So I mentioned we have the left brain and the right brain, and some things are duplicated in the brain, like our sensory systems. But some things are what we call lateralized, meaning one side of the brain is more specialized for that task than the other. And I already mentioned that language in 90% of people is found on the left side of the brain and is not found on the right side of the brain. It's such a complex process that we just create one area that can do it instead of trying to create two areas to do the same thing in the brain. Other things about our brain have to do with sort of more complex processing. So if I put three letters up on the screen, ask you to think about what are the first three letters you see there, right? Some of you are probably going to see the H and the C and the L first. Others of you might see the S and the N and the U. And hopefully everybody can see both, right? Depending on what you focus on. Right? And so when we talk about looking at details like the S, the N, and the U, that's an analytic task. And the left side of our brain tends to be more active. If we look at brain scans, the left side of the brain lights up more, is more active when we're doing detail-oriented perceptions or tasks. And the right side of the brain tends to focus more on holistic perceptions like the H and the C and the L. And the right side of the brain gets more active when we ask people to identify the large letters and sort of ignore the little parts. And we also see this not just with people that we put in brain scanners, but people who unfortunately have strokes on one side of the brain or the other side of the brain show some deficits as well. So if we ask a patient with right hemisphere damage that is going to affect their holistic perception, right, to replicate this target, so we show them a capital M made of little z's, they have a hard time seeing the M. In fact, there's very little evidence they see the M shape at all. They just see the Z's. They just perceive the Z's. I'm saying see. They see both of them, right? But they are just sort of perceiving that. And if we ask someone with left side damage to replicate that, they perceive the overall holistic shape, but don't see the details or are able to perceive the details. And it's not just language-based. You might say, well, those are N's and C's, and you just said languages on the left side of the brain. We can do this with just shapes. If we give them a triangle made out of rectangles, the analytic intact side only sees the details, the rectangles, and again, the holistic intact side sees the whole picture, sees the triangle, but has a hard time seeing the parts of the triangle. All right, so moving on to some sort of broader cognitions, emotion that is of interest to everybody, but particularly I would think people in counseling, is very broadly distributed in the brain. And a long time ago, we used to think that emotion was lateralized, in particular that the right side of the brain was kind of a more negative side of the brain, and the left side of the brain was a more positive side of the brain. And some of that was based on case studies very early on of people who had brain damage. And in particular, there's a famous case study of a rail worker who had a spike that blew up and went through his head, and he survived, but it destroyed part of his left frontal lobe. And he changed from being a very personable, hardworking personality into sort of a very ornery drunkard who couldn't hold a job down and got in fights all the time. And so this notion that, oh, the right side of the brain does that and the left side of the brain does the opposite, sort of got born. And now that we're able to do things like look at people's brains in a scanner and see what's activated when they are either perceiving a certain emotion or experiencing a certain emotion, we see that happiness is found all throughout the brain, in the frontal lobes, in the temporal lobe. We obviously have memories of happiness, even back here in the visual parts of the brain. It's really a lot of different parts of the brain on the side and on the inside of the brain. So looking at the medial side, we see happy everywhere. We see sadness in blue represented broadly throughout the brain. So it is, so that's pretty interesting, I think, is that we don't have like these little compact areas for emotion, right? It also makes studying emotion pretty difficult because emotion is so interconnected with a lot of things that we do. It's interconnected with our decision making. It's interconnected with our memories. It's interconnected with our hunger and feeding. I mean, there's so many things that emotion is interconnected with. So everything I've sort of been talking about so far has really been focused on that surface of the brain, the cortex of the brain. There are also important structures inside the brain. And in particular, with relation to emotion, there are some structures that do sort of specific emotional tasks. And so in pink here, we see an area, or the pink boxes, the cingulate and the mammillary bodies represent emotional areas of the brain, things like judging other people's emotion and making decisions based on emotion and emotional outcomes. The amygdala is shown in blue right here, and it's called the amygdala because it has an almond-like shape. It's a pretty small structure. It turns out to be a really important structure. And one of the main jobs of the amygdala is giving emotional value to stimuli. And that could be external stimuli, like that piece of chocolate cake has a high emotional value to me. But it can also be internal stimuli as well. And we'll talk about the amygdala today because when we experience things, like say a traumatic experience, right? The memory associated with what happened during that traumatic experience gets assigned these deep negative emotional values by the amygdala. And one of the neurotransmitters that's involved with the amygdala helping assign these emotional values is norepinephrine that we talked about. And that'll become important towards the end of our talk today. There's also an area called the thalamus that's sort of buried. It's hard to see. It's like buried deep in the brain here. And all of our sensory systems come into the brain through nerves and go to the thalamus, and each of our sensory systems has a particular nucleus or area of the thalamus where it congregates. So there's a touch area, and there's a taste area, and there's a vision area, and a hearing area, and so on. And from there, the thalamus then sends that information to the different parts of the brain that I just talked about. So if we talk about vision, the signal from your eyes comes in to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends that signal to the occipital cortex, to the occipital lobe, right? And the job of the thalamus is to filter and regulate sensory information. If we had a straight wired connection from all of our senses directly into our brain, it simply would overload our brain with information. And so we have built into our brain a filtering system to say, you know, I hear you sensory, I hear you touch system, but right now you're not that important, and I'm trying to do a lot of other stuff in my cortex, and so I'm gonna just say, you're not getting through right now, right? So if I ask everybody, I can't see your feet, so I don't know if you're wearing shoes, but if I ask you to think about your shoes and how your shoes feel on your feet, you can feel that right now. But 30 seconds ago, you were not perceiving your shoes, right? And so the thalamus was filtering out that signal because it was not meaningful. It was just going to occupy processing power in your brain when it didn't need to be, right? The same thing happens with the auditory system. So if there's a fan or an air conditioner or some kind of constant noise in your environment, until I ask you to pay attention to it or I bring it to your attention, the thalamus is sort of suppressing that and not letting that information from your ears come in and sort of interfere with the rest of the stuff going on in the brain. So why is this important? Why am I going on about this? Well, it turns out when we sleep, the thalamus shuts down the external stimuli. Like obviously, hopefully when you're sleeping, you have your eyes closed. And so you're really not getting much visual stimulation, but things like noises that are happening, if you're not awakened by every noise that happens. Now, hopefully the thalamus isn't fully filtering everything. And so if it's a noise that your body needs to be alarmed by, you will wake up, right? But the thalamus is really important in sleep in terms of helping us sleep and filtering out those external stimuli. All right. The hippocampus is this sort of pinkish purplish area deep in, would be the temporal lobe here, just behind the amygdala and deep in the temporal lobe. And the hippocampus is like the inbox for our memories, right? So if we're experiencing something and we want to form a memory, it goes through the hippocampus. And then the hippocampus kind of takes it in the inbox and stores it in the right folder. And hopefully you remember where you stored that in the temporal lobe so that when you want to go retrieve that memory, you can go find it, right? So that's sort of the whole job of the hippocampus, is to take incoming experiences, and if they're meaningful, store them in the temporal lobe where hopefully you can find them later. And then finally, this green area sort of underneath the thalamus, hence why it's called the hypothalamus, is involved with regulating our body states. And so that would be things like I mentioned, reproduction, that would be feeding and hunger, that would be even things like body temperature and thirst. And also our sleep-wake cycle. So we'll talk about a particular part of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, big name, that is our clock, essentially, in our body that helps us do what we call circadian rhythms, or our 24-hour rhythms that we are performing. All right, so those are sort of the major internal areas that we want to be concerned with. There's a couple others involved with motor systems and things like that, but this is sort of the ones that are relevant to what we might want to talk about today. All right, so I want to shift. That was your brief neuroanatomy synopsis. And talk a little bit about how the brain communicates, because this is really important, particularly for understanding sleep and understanding the differences between slow wave or deep sleep and REM or dreaming sleep. So our brain is made up of a whole bunch of cells called neurons. And it's also made up of some other cells called glial cells that are sort of the glue that hold all the neurons together. So our peripheral sensory and motor nerves are neurons and function the same way as all the billions of cells that we have in our cortex, right? So the brain is just this mass of connected neurons, and those glue cells, those glial cells, that are sort of insulating and holding everything together. All neurons have 4 common components, and they all do those things. But depending on what the job of the neuron is, it might be specialized in one or more of those 4 sort of areas, right? And as I just mentioned, the CNS is the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside of that. And that's important because peripheral neurons, when they get damaged, can actually be repaired. they can repair themselves. There's other cells that can help repair them. And this is why if you were to have a major cut on your arm that severed some neurons, that you wouldn't necessarily lose motor and sensory control of your hand. You might have to go to rehabilitative therapy to sort of reprogram your hand how to work. But those neurons can actually regrow if they're damaged, and that sort of makes sense because throughout nature and history, it wouldn't be uncommon to damage your limbs, and it would make sense to have them be able to repair themselves and regain function. However, in the central nervous system, neurons do not have this ability. And this is why you'll hear people say, that once you lose neurons in your brain, they're gone forever. Now, that doesn't mean that if somebody has a stroke or has some form of brain injury, that injury is permanent, because often the brain can find other ways around the damaged area, or other parts of the brain that maybe did something different can be reprogrammed to do the task of the damaged part of the brain. All of that happens through extensive rehabilitative therapy, but the brain is very resilient in that way that it can recover from damage, even though the damaged area is no longer able to be repaired or is able to be fixed. So we can see recovery of function, but we don't necessarily see recovery of the actual brain structures there. All right, so what are these common structures that all neurons have? And so the structures and the four sort of jobs they do go hand in hand. And so the first job of neurons is to receive input. And, if we're talking about a sensory system, like I mentioned, the retina in the eye, where we have light coming in, and that light is going to stimulate rods and cones, and that's going to provide the input to those neurons. In our brain, it's going to be another neuron stimulating another neuron. And so the input can come from another neuron as well. Those parts of the neuron are called dendrites. They receive the incoming signals. All the dendrites funnel down into the cell body of the neuron here, which is called the soma. And so basically you can think, and that's where processing is going to happen. So you think about a neuron's going to collect all its input, funnel it down into the body, and then make a decision based on that input of, do I send an output or not send an output? And so the inputs coming in are all chemical signals, as we mentioned, neurotransmitters, right? And they are converted then into these electrical signals. And if the electrical signals add up to be enough, then the neuron sends an output down through the axon, which is like a wire, to wherever its target is. And then at its target, it's going to release its chemical signal to its next connection, right? Myelin sheaths here are like insulation around the wire, right, to help the electrical signal be conducted faster and more efficiently. And those are a type of glial cell, a type of support cell in the brain. All right. Again, the type of neurotransmitter that's released at the synapse, at that gap in between the neuron's output and its target input, right? That type of chemical is going to mean something to that target, right? So if this was a connection with a heart muscle, if this is a sympathetic neuron and it's releasing norepinephrine, then that's going to cause this heart muscle to beat faster. If it's a parasympathetic and it's releasing acetylcholine, then that's going to cause that muscle to beat slower. Right? So the synapse is what we call the tiny space in between the output of a neuron and the input of its target, be it a muscle fiber or be it another neuron. All right, so as I mentioned, all neurons do those four things, right? Input, processing, output, release neurotransmitter. That's how they work. Right? But they might be specialized depending on what their job is, right? So we were just looking at a motor neuron. A motor neuron is going to cause a muscle fiber to contract, and it's getting input, making a decision. Hey, was that a big enough signal that I need to make my muscle contract? And then if the answer is yes, it's going to go send its signal and the muscle's going to contract. Right? If we look at a sensory neuron that's embedded in the skin, right? So it's receiving its input from receptors in the skin that are related to touch and pressure, or maybe temperature. What is the job of a sensory neuron? The job of a sensory neuron is to get that signal up to the brain so the brain can decide if that's important or not. Right? We don't really want our sensory neurons making decisions about, did that thing that touched me, was that enough touch? Should I let the brain know that something touched me or that temperature changed? And so if you look at a sensory neuron, it has its dendrites. It looks much more like a wire though. And the soma, which is the processing part that's going to make a decision, is kind of marginalized. It's kind of out here to the side. It has components in it that are kind of like machinery, like the nucleus and some other things that help the neuron, do its jobs. But it's more of a like storage place for those things, that machinery, than it is a processing center. And so that signal's pretty much going to bypass the decision making and go on into the spinal cord, where it can be sent up to the brain and allow the brain to make a decision. Let the thalamus decide if that's important information or not important information that needs to go up. Okay. All right. So again, sort of looking at neurons, you can kind of tell what kind of job they're doing based on the shape, based on what's important to them, right? And so a unipolar, that's what we just talked about with a sensory neuron. There's a lot of bipolar neurons. That's kind of like what the motor neuron was. It has a sort of selected input from a certain area, and then it has a certain output to another area. But there's other things like pyramidal cells. They're called that because the shape of the cell body kind of looks like a pyramid. And it looks like a pyramid because it's getting input from other parts in the brain that are maybe higher than this neuron. And it's also getting inputs from its neighboring neurons as well on the sides. So for this neuron, input from different areas of the brain, as well as looking at what its neighbors are doing, is very important to this neuron. And we can tell that based on its shape. And then these typically have a single output that's sometimes very long. And in fact, those long wires of the corpus callosum that we talked about that connect the left and the right hemisphere, those typically are pyramidal cells. Those are the axons of pyramidal cells that are looking at the area in this one part of the brain and then relaying it to the other side of the brain to say, hey, this is what I'm doing. What are you doing? And that side of the brain is doing the same thing, sending its signal back over to the other side as well. In the cerebellum, we have some really interesting cells. So if you remember the cerebellum, that little part of the brain in the back, I said was involved with motor coordination, so sort of sensory motor coordination. And here, look at the input. It has this huge dendritic field, a lot of input. So it's looking at a lot of different things in order to perform that sensory motor coordination. And then depending on what it sees in that input, it's sending sort of a single output back to the motor system of how to respond. So again, the fact that all neurons do these four kinds of jobs, by looking at the shape of a neuron, we can begin to sort of understand what that neuron's doing. All right. So I've kind of already talked about this. I kind of just want to summarize it a little bit. But we have electrical signals within a neuron, right? So the inputs come in, we call those synaptic potentials. That's not really important that you know that name, but these are when the chemical signals get turned into electrical signals, that's what's used to process that signal. And then the output, if we decide, yes, that neuron should send an output, that's called an action potential. You kind of think about action potential and axon. They both start with A. That's the signal going down the wire to the output. And then we're going to have chemical signals here. Now, I'm talking a lot about electricity and electrical signals, and sometimes electricity can be sort of a abstract concept for people because you can't see it. You can feel it if you put your finger in an outlet, right? But it's hard to sort of conceptualize and kind of understand it, right? So I like to, when I'm teaching this to my students, talk about electricity kind of like plumbing, right? Because people they understand plumbing because they can see water, they see pipes, they kind of understand that sort of thing. So voltage is like pressure, right? Current is like the water, right? So you can have a current that's not moving very hard because the pressure is very low, right? So you can have water in a pipe and you turn it on, but there's no pressure, and so it doesn't move very hard. So if I were to, so you have a certain water pressure in your house, and you have a hose, a garden hose that you can hook up to a nozzle on the side of your house, and you get the water pressure out of that. Now, if I were to take that garden hose and hook it up to a fire hydrant somehow, right? The pressure in a fire hydrant is way greater than the pressure in your house. And so that's going to blow that little hose up. I mean, the hoses they hook up to fire hydrants are huge, right? And they're reinforced, and there's a lot of pressure because they need a lot of water to come out of the fire hydrants, right? So some voltages to sort of be aware of. A wall outlet, as I'm sure you probably know, is 120 volts. And we plug a lot of things into wall outlets, right? We plug microwaves, vacuum cleaners, hair dryers, a lot of things that need a lot of force to work. We're operating motors and things, right? A cell phone we plug into an outlet, but you don't plug your cell phone directly in the outlet because a cell phone only needs about 5 volts in order to charge it, in order to operate. It's much more delicate, if you will. It doesn't need that pressure. It's sort of like your garden hose compared to the fire hydrant. So you have that little block that you have to use to plug into the wall, and that block is basically filtering out 115 volts and just allowing 5 volts to go on your cell phone, right? A AAA battery has 1.5 volts, right? So only the things that a AAA battery can operate are usually really small electronics, right? In order to, because they don't have that much pressure to move the parts, right? Which is why if you have a bigger flashlight, you may need multiple batteries, right, to add up to get to the volts, the pressure you need to cause that light to light up. So I mentioned all this to say that the electricity in your body, a neuron, is 0.07 volts, right? So a fraction of what a AAA battery is, and or 70 millivolts, right? So this is why very much not a good idea to stick your finger in a wall outlet. You're sending 120 volts through something that's designed to only handle 0.07 volts, right? That will fry the system, so to speak, right? So a neuron, so we talk about electricity in the body, but it's not electricity like we think about it in terms of our electronics, our home electronics and that sort of thing. And neurons can be really low because they regenerate this signal and for reasons we don't really need to get into today. But I think hopefully that helps you sort of understand when I'm talking about electricity, that you're able to see the scope of what that is, right? But it is fast, just like the electricity in a wall outlet's fast. It operates at the same sort of speed. All right, so we're through that part. The other part is what I've been talking about, the chemical signals, the neurotransmitters that happen in between the neurons, their targets. That synapse is tiny. It is often several microns big. I mean, tiny, tiny, so hard that for a long time we couldn't even see the space with the microscopes that we had. So for a long time, people thought the nervous system was just all a big web that was all connected. It was only until we developed good enough microscopes that we were able to see these small spaces in between these neurons. So that's good because chemicals don't move very fast. They got to be released by one side and quickly float over to the other side and bind to it, right? But again, so why do we care about all this? Well, the point of having chemicals, as I've mentioned repeatedly, is to have different signals. Different chemicals can mean different things to their targets. And so why do you care about this? Well, in terms of neural signaling in general, strengthening and weakening these connections between neurons in the brain is called plasticity. And our brain is constantly changing, for better or for worse, hopefully for better. But often in counseling, you're dealing with changes that happened in the brain that made the situation worse for that client, right? And this is called plasticity. And so understanding that the brain is malleable and that these connections can get stronger based on more use, or weaker based on less use, or something else coming in and sort of reprogramming those signals, can be really important, particularly for understanding counseling in terms of neuroscience. And then also drugs. So, and not just illicit drugs like alcohol. Well, I mean, alcohol is legal, but drugs, recreational drugs, I should say, but psychoactive drugs, right? So when we talk about antidepressants, or we talk about anxiolytic drugs, these are chemicals that we've, in the most part, created or found in nature that go in and act like or disrupt the natural neurotransmitters in our brain. And so by understanding the chemical signaling and how that sort of works at a conceptual level, I think it helps you understand why drugs can have the effects that they have, and why they might be selective for certain areas, and why they might have side effects in different areas. Yeah. So mentioning that, just
I have a question.
Yes,
Dave.
question.
I'm sorry. So now I came in late to this party, so you may have already talked about this. Would there be a chance, like what you were talking about on the previous slide, would some of the signals sent out be received while others aren't? Like as far as like between the neurons with the neurotransmitters, like if sending out a bunch of stuff, right, whether it's by medicine or natural dopamine or whatever, is there chances that some would be received and some wouldn't?
Yes. So just to sort of rephrase what you're saying, all of them are received, right? But they have to be a big enough reception, right, in order to cause the output at the next neuron, right? If the signal's too small, then the neuron processes that and says, no, too small, not going to do anything with that, right? So this output signal, this action potential, the output to go on to the next part of the process, right, is an all or nothing. If the signal, the input's too small, nothing happens. If the signal is big enough, it gets the output going, right? And there's disturbances in the nervous system that can affect the size of those signals, right? So for instance, you could have changes in the brain, maybe based on repeated experiences, that cause your neurons not to release as much of a neurotransmitter for emotion as it once did. And so when we talk about depression and we talk about serotonin as a neurotransmitter involved in that, antidepressant drugs increase artificially the amount of serotonin present. And the idea is that it's increasing it enough to get over that input level that's deficient in the depressed brain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. So, okay, so you said this sort of, which was my next question, which is, can we do something to help that connection, that all or none connection? So one of those things is clearly chemicals with drugs. And you may talk about this later. So are there other things that we can do to help ourselves or other people to increase that? Would that be, I'm trying to like use the language, would that be like when you talked about the plumbing method, the flow of the water, like, because it's not enough, or is that what that would be compared to?
Yeah. So absolutely. Drugs can artificially manipulate the system, right? But even better than that is experience and use can strengthen those connections, right? And cause more neurotransmitter to be released, and actually cause more connections to form, right? So it becomes easier if you have a neuron that only has 5 connections with another neuron, and those 2 neurons talk to each other a lot and communicate a lot, then it may increase to 10 connections instead of 5. And now you don't need as big a signal because you have 10 connections instead of 5. So that's when I say plasticity, that's what I'm talking about, is the ability of our use of our brain. Just like I talked about, if you were to injure your hand, you would need to go to physical therapy to relearn how to move your hand, right? So we can relearn how to use parts of our brain through practice, through that same sort of, it's basically mental rehabilitation by learning, by practicing certain cognitive patterns and practicing certain techniques. We can strengthen those connections so that they're better able to talk to each other. And that, doing that through counseling, which is what counseling is, right, is helping people change their cognitive patterns, reinterpret how they're interpreting certain situations, and reinterpret their behavioral outcomes for those certain situations. By internalizing that and practicing that, you can reshape the brain in a much more permanent way than drugs can ever do, right? And in fact, there's a lot of issues with drugs, and I'll talk about sleep aids and sleep drugs because sleep is such an important and sensitive process that drugs really, we don't have a drug that induces sleep. We have drugs that induce unconsciousness or sedation, and you think you're sleeping because you're not awake, but it's not sleep. So particularly when we talk about sleep, I'll talk a lot about behaviors and experiences that can help, that we can do, things that we can do to help change those circuits and strengthen those circuits. Good?
Thank you. Yeah, very helpful. Yeah.
All right, so almost through this section. Neurotransmitters, they're chemicals. The chemicals have certain shapes, like you see all these different shapes down here, right? I have some sort of simple ones here. The shapes fit in their receptors like a lock and a key, right? And so a ball shape only fits in a ball shape size, a triangle shape only fits in a triangle shape receptor. And so certain chemicals may, like this chemical here, may have parts that activate 3 different receptors, but it won't activate this receptor. And some of them are more selective. This chemical here only fits in that one receptor and it can't activate these other ones, right? So when I talk about the ability of chemicals to do specific things and have selectivity, this receptor may cause the heart to speed up, and this receptor causes it to slow down, and it takes 2 different chemicals to activate those receptors, right? 2 different shapes to activate those. And if I create an artificial chemical, like amphetamines, have a shape that fits in the speed the heart up receptor. And so it has side effects because it also fits in other receptors as well. All right. So, our brain doesn't have any walls in it. It just is this mass of these connected neurons sending their signals to different places and the glial cells holding it all together. But it's kind of like a big suit. And so by using different chemicals in different parts of the brain, we can keep those parts from interfering with each other, from crosstalk, because the chemicals in the part of the brain right next to it is a different chemical and the receptors are different. And so we don't need a wall because even if that chemical drifts over there, it can't activate that system, right? That said, in fairly distant parts of the brain may use the same neurotransmitter because they're not worried about crosstalk because they're in different locations. And that's where we get into side effects, because dopamine is used in the reward system of the brain. And we may have someone who has a problem with addiction and we want to turn down the reward system, but dopamine is also used in the part of the brain that's involved with your heart rate. And so we don't really want to turn down your heart rate. So that would be a negative side effect, right? So it's not as simple as saying we're going to use this drug, because we can't limit where the drug is having its effect in the brain. It's going to have it everywhere, right? It's going to be systemic. And that's the issue with side effects.
That is so interesting.
these are a bunch of different neurotransmitters. Again, this is not, I'm just sort of throwing this at you just to know that, I mean, there are literally hundreds of neurotransmitters. So these are some of the big ones. Glutamate and GABA are kind of our like discrete message signaling. So if we are wanting to excite a part of the brain, we're going to use glutamate. If we want to inhibit a part of the brain, we're going to use GABA. So when we talk about going to sleep at night, a lot of GABA is released in your brain, and that kind of shuts your brain down and allows it to sleep. It's sort of a general inhibitor of activity. We've already mentioned acetylcholine and norepinephrine today when we talked about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. It's also used in a lot of different areas. So in your brain, norepinephrine is sort of the, it's kind of like the fight or flight of your brain. It's if you need to be hyper vigilant, something serious, important is happening, then your brain gets flooded with norepinephrine. And I'll talk about this when I talk about PTSD today, because in PTSD, in that traumatic experience, the brain's being flooded with norepinephrine, and that's in part what kind of cements those traumatic memories into place. And fortunately, we've learned some therapy with sleep to help sort of erase that effect, that memory effect. And I'll talk about that. Dopamine, as I mentioned, is a reward system. It's also part of the attention system. So if you ever have clients that have ADHD and they're on medications, this is raising dopamine levels in their frontal lobe. Again, there can be side effects of that. It's sort of mild. It doesn't typically act on the reward system at the doses that those sort of ADHD drugs are being given. Endorphins are natural chemicals to help us control pain, but opioid drugs mimic endorphins, and that's how they have their pain control mechanisms. And then serotonin, I mentioned, is involved with mood, with particularly low levels of serotonin appear to be associated with depression because increasing those levels often alleviates some of the depressive symptoms. But serotonin is also involved with sleep. So serotonin is a sleep signal. It helps our brain get to sleep. Acetylcholine is kind of an awake signal, kind of the yin to serotonin's yang in the sleep-wake cycle. And serotonin also has a role in appetite. So if someone is depressed and it involves a change in their serotonin system, that may also affect their sleep, and it may also affect their eating as well. And so these things are all kind of wrapped up into one system. All right, lastly, once we release these chemicals into this little synapse and they go do their thing, we got to get rid of them. We don't want them to accumulate and keep doing their thing out there. So there's three different ways that we get these chemicals out of the synapse. One, we can take them back up and recycle them and reuse them. Our brain's very efficient. Why make more norepinephrine if I can just grab you and stick you back in here and reuse you, right? And that's called reuptake. We have enzymes, chemicals floating around in here that when it interacts with that serotonin molecule, it breaks it in half, and then it can no longer do its thing at the receptor side. So we can break down the neurotransmitters with enzymes, with chemicals. And then finally, those glial cells that are the glue, sort of the support cells, they can also help clean up things, and they can absorb neurotransmitter, pull it out of the synapse, and get rid of it. Why do you need to know about this, right? Because several different drug targets are acting on these removal mechanisms to increase or decrease the presence of a neurotransmitter. So for instance, most of the antidepressants are either blocking the ability of serotonin to be recycled, which means there's more here now to activate the target, or they're blocking the enzyme that breaks down serotonin. And so again, that increases the effectiveness of serotonin in the signal. So those are your SSRIs. Those are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, right? and your MAOIs are inhibiting the monoamine oxidase enzyme that is oxidizing or breaking down serotonin, right? So often drugs will target those mechanisms to try and increase them. If we need to decrease a neurotransmitter, there are drugs that will go in and artificially break that neurotransmitter down. So sort of increasing the breakdown by an enzyme is a way we can decrease levels of neurotransmitters. So again, these are common kind of pharmacological targets that drug companies use to manipulate neurotransmitter levels. All right, so I mentioned plasticity. And so plasticity is the ability of the brain, the connections in the brain to change over time and with experience. And what really, really drives this is experience. The changes is experience. It's learning, right? And so we talked about PTSD, where you have this sort of one trial learning, a very traumatic event that becomes cemented because it's so overwhelming to the brain within the memory system. And then that person has a hard time getting rid of that traumatic memory. In major depressive disorder, there's a condition that's actually called learned hopelessness, and where people who have so many times been in situations that were negative and they felt out of control, that they just learned to not try to have that control anymore. And this is a negative learning experience that happens in the brain. But the positive side of that is that you can reverse that with unlearning or relearning, right? If we can change a brain in a maladaptive way, through positive experience, we can change it back to, in an adaptive way, back to a more normal, healthy, connective brain, right? And again, like I said, this is the basis of therapy and treatment. In order to have successful therapy, a patient has to buy into that, commit to it, practice it, embrace it. And if they don't do that, if they don't do the therapy, you think about like physical therapy, it's mental therapy. If they don't do the exercises, then the connections won't change on their end, right? So the point of that is just to say, yes, so there's some biology that we're born with and that we have to deal with, but most of that can be changed based on experience and behavior, right? When does brain development end? Well, there's a big part of development, as you know, as children, they're learning lots of things, not just information, but also how to walk, how to talk, how to respond emotionally, how to interact socially, lots of different things. And so there's lots of plasticity that's happening in childhood. But our brains continue to form new connections, change throughout our entire lifespan, not in such dramatic ways as they do in childhood, but certainly they do. And so I mention this for two reasons. One is to say that we can't expect maybe children or adolescent cognition to be the same as adult cognition, because the brain is not there yet, right? It's not fully developed. It's still changing. And that period up until about 20 years of age is a time the brain is very sensitive to external things, because it's in a state of willingness to change a lot. And so we have to be very careful with what drugs we expose the brain to in those times, and the experiences that the brain is exposed to in those times. Lost my ability to go forward here. Here we go. So this just sort of illustrates that as you see these different images of the brain, age from age 4 to age 21, when they start out at 4, there's a lot of red and yellow, which shows an underdeveloped brain. And you can see as the purples come in, all the way up until the early 20s, the brain is developing. The last part of the brain to develop are the frontal lobes, right? So if we look here at adolescence, a lot of the other parts of the brain are showing up in purple, but those frontal lobes and the memory areas are sort of the last areas to fully develop there, right? So there's sort of a progression almost from the rear of the brain to the front of the brain. And so the least developed parts of the brain in adolescence are personality, emotion, decision-making, rational thought, all of the things that teenagers do that we say, why are you doing this? It's because in a lot of ways, it's not really their fault. Their brain's just not able to make those decisions, right? So if children have less connections and less connectivity than adults, what does that mean? Well, it means they have to expend a lot more brain power in order to get to the same outcome that an adult has to do, right? So here's working memory tasks in children, and you see, look how much harder the brain's working here than the adult. Working a lot harder here than the adult brain is in order to get to that same successful outcome, right? So we have to have some understanding. Look at how hard the children's brains are having to work to get the right decision, right? All right. And lastly, and then we'll take a little break. I know I went a little long in this first section, but as I mentioned, experience continues to shape our brain. And so this is a study that was done looking at people that started playing video games in their 20s after their brain was pretty much fully developed. And they had a group of people that played 20 plus hours, I think, a week of video games. That was the high gamer. And people that played under 5 hours a week, that was the low gamer group. And then they gave them two tasks, a proactive task, which they had to make a decision based on internal processes, and a reactive task where they had to respond to external stimuli. And they looked at their brain patterns, and presumably these groups were similar before they started, playing video games in their 20s. And the low gamers do much better and have a higher level of brain activity associated with making internal thoughts and decision making than the high gamers, which actually had a significantly lower amount of activity dedicated to those areas and weren't making as accurate decisions. But on the reactive part, the high gamers are actually doing better at the task and using more brain activity than the low. And if you think about what playing a video game is, it's a lot of responding to external stimuli. I mean, there might be some internal sort of strategy taking place, but a lot of it is interacting with what you're seeing on the screen. And all of that experience those high gamers have effectively shaped their brain to be better at dealing with external stimuli, but not as good at making internal decisions.
So, okay, I got another thing to say. I know we're on a schedule, but so I can't remember if it was either a conversation I had with Morgan or if this was a conversation I had with Ginger this week. But Dave, maybe you and I have talked about this too, is that recently this, and I wonder if it's actually based on this research, that TSA has put out a call for these high gamers to be the people who, what are they called? The
screeners.
That do to help the planes that are in the towers. They have such a high burnout rate. What are they called?
Air traffic controllers.
Air traffic controllers, because there is such a shortage and they are so high burnout that this is what they need, that high reactive piece to be able to look at the screen, right? And do that. So that's super interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And I mean, that just gets also at, whatever your career is, if you're doing that for 30 years, I mean, you're not playing video games, but if you're looking at, computer screens and responding to external stimuli for 30 years, that's shaping the way your brain functions, right? Effectively.